Story 1. It had to be either Duck Hunt or Tetris. Maybe I was 4 or 5. Story 2. I played the original Spyro the Dragon on PlayStation 1. I was about 5 years old, so it was more the thrill of charging around, flying, and breathing fire than actually completing the game. After that, I mostly stopped playing video games, although I downloaded the Reignited trilogy and completed the game 100% because I owed it to myself. Story 3. I'm not sure about the first, but my earliest gaming memories are of playing Tony Hawk's Underground and Spider-Man on the original Xbox. Story 4. I think it was Monsters Incorporated on the PlayStation 1. I was about 5 or 6 years old. Story 5. I was 3 when I used Reader Rabbit. It ran on an old 5.5-inch floppy disk drive computer with a black and yellow screen that was new at the time. Story 6. My earliest gaming memory is probably playing Yoshi's Island on the Super Nintendo Entertainment System with my dad when I was about 5. I miss those days. Story 7. I played Grand Theft Auto Vice City when I was around 10, I think, then I moved on to Need for Speed. Story 8. I was 6. My dad snuck me into the Department of Agriculture where he worked in the District of Columbia, and we played a Star Trek game on a mainframe. Each move was printed on dot matrix printers. The photon torpedoes were asterisks. It was glorious. Story 9. Maybe it was Minesweeper on the personal computer. It could have been the original Sonic the Hedgehog, Wolfenstein 3-dimensional, Mario on the original Game Boy, or Skyroads. Story 10. Pinball Space Cadet and Super Mario for the Microsoft Disk Operating System, if I can recall. Story 11. Pac-Man was built into a plastic case modeled like a big stand-up arcade game, but it was only about 8 inches tall, I think. I played that thing for hours. It took D-size batteries, but I was given an adapter that had D-size inserts to fill the battery compartment, like rechargeable batteries with a wire permanently attached to one of them. Story 12. Pong was followed quite a while later by Flimbo's Quest on the Commodore 64. 6 or 7 for Pong, 10 for Flimbo's Quest. Story 13. When I was probably 2 to 3 years old, the babysitter would bring her Nintendo 64 over for us to play Mario Kart 64. Story 14. Monkey Island 2, LeChuck's Revenge. I was 6 years old and had just learned to read. It was one of my dad's favorite games, and he wanted to show it to me. Story 15. Pokemon Red. I did not know how to read or save the game yet, so I kept replaying the first 2 gyms. Notably, I think I managed to manipulate the game's random number generator the same way for months. I always encountered a Pikachu first in the forest. Story 16. Bonk's Adventure or Keith's Courage. I can't remember how old I was. Probably around 10. Story 17. Space Commanders, 1983, by Columbia Data Products. Story 18. Probably Pokemon Gold on the Game Boy Color. Good times. Story 19. I played Quake 2 on a personal computer at age 5. My dad got me a Game Boy with Pokemon shortly after, and that was a little more my speed. Story 20. I was 5, maybe even 4, but the earliest game I remember is Super Mario Bros. 3 on the Nintendo Entertainment System. If it was not that, it was Pokemon when it came to the West in 1998. Story 21. The first game I specifically remember playing was Ocarina of Time, but it blends with Pokemon Red, so I don't actually know which came first. Story 22. I watched my brother play a lot of video games growing up, but I think the first game I truly committed to was Pokemon Emerald. I was about 10 to 12 years old and cannot quite remember. Story 23. I think I was either 3 or 4 years old, and according to my older brother, the first game I ever played was World Wrestling Federation Warzone for the PlayStation 1. Story 24. Asterix and Obelix, as well as Spider-Man and Pokemon, on the Game Boy Color. I was probably 8 years old. Story 25. Tony Hawk's Pro Skater or James Bond, 007. I was about 5 years old and have fuzzy, nostalgic memories. Story 26. I think it was a Disney game featuring Donald Duck for PlayStation 1. Story 27. I played Super Mario Land when I was 4. My brother would let me play his Game Boy Color every night before I went to sleep. Story 28. My first game was Contra on the Nintendo Entertainment System. I was about 5 and I thought the Konami code was actual magic. Story 29. An old Star Wars game. I was 5. It ran on Windows 95. I think you only controlled ships, but I am not sure. Story 30. I got Pokemon Yellow version and started playing it on the morning of my 10th birthday. For context, I just turned 35 last week. Story 31. My earliest memory is of some kind of racing, possibly one of the first Need for Speed games. I cannot say for sure, since I never took an interest in racing afterward. I was 3 or 4 years old. I am now 23. Story 32. I'm not sure, but it was either Pitfall on the Atari 2600 or King's Quest on Microsoft 3.1. Both when I was about 5. Story 33. Xenon 2 and Superplex on an old International Business Machines computer. It was probably 6 years old at the time. Story 34. It's too hard to answer accurately. The first video game I owned and completed was Mega Man X. The first video game I ever played was probably The Lion King for the Super Nintendo Entertainment System. Story 35. Jackal for the Nintendo Entertainment System. I was 6 years old, and the other game is probably Tetris. Story 36. Grand Theft Auto. San Andreas on a friend's computer. Toxic on Friv on my personal computer. Story 37. I do not remember the specific game, but it was in Intellivision. Story 38. Are these real accounts? This is about the 10th time I have seen this question in the last few days. Story 39. I cannot remember its name, but I remember vividly what it looked like. It was a futuristic police game with flying cars. It had a blue trail coming out of the back, if I remember correctly. The main objective was chasing down other cars and destroying them with rockets and front-mounted machine guns. There were green grids everywhere. It was on the PlayStation 1. I am almost certain, and I was around 7 or 8 at the time. Story 40. Playing Missile Command and Asteroids on Windows 95 started my interest in gaming. Ever since then, I have been an avid gamer. Story 41. I played Frogger on my friend's ColecoVision when I was about 6 or 7 years old. Story 42. It was Pong on a Radio Shack game system attached to our multimedia smorgasbord stereo, 8-track, radio, and television. It had little levers that went up and down. Sometime after that, we got a Sears-branded Atari 2600. Story 43. Friday the 13th for the Nintendo Entertainment System or Civilization 2. I got a burned, definitely legal yard sale copy. It's a close race for which one hit my memory bank first, but either way I was 4 or 5. Story 44. My parents were gamers, so I have no memory of it because I was too young. My first gaming memory is playing Gauntlet with my dad. Story 45. I can't remember the first one exactly, aside from those old educational personal computer games, but I have strong memories of Toy Story 2 and Lego Creator. Story 46. Probably Tetris or something at an unknown age, but the first personal computer game I can remember was Ski Free at about 7 or 8. That fucking robot Yeti. Story 47. I think it was RoboCop vs. Terminator on the Sega Mega Drive. I would have been about 5, maybe. Story 48. Either Kirby or Duck Hunt on the Nintendo Entertainment System. I was probably 7 or so. Story 49. Frogger on the Atari 2600 on a black and white television. Good times, I think. Story 50. I don't remember the name, but it was a two-dimensional pixel platformer on the phone, and at the end of the game the character boards a blimp and flies away. Story 51. The slot machine program ran on a room-sized International Business Machines computer at my brother's high school around 1975, when I was about 10 years old. The game worked by pressing the Enter key and the computer printed the random results. It did not have a display. Story 52. My first Xbox game was Skyrim, and it is still my all-time favorite. Story 53. I played Pong in 1977 when I was 11. I still have every game console I have ever owned, and most of them still work. Story 54. Maybe Wavy Navy or Choplifter. 1983 Apple II Plus compatible personal computer. Story 55. Moonlander ran on a Digital Equipment Corporation program data processor 8 and was controlled with a light pen on a vector graphics display. It was rack-mounted, as I recall, so I am not sure if it was a GT40 display or a variant. This was around 1976 at a physics department open house. I would have been about 13. The light pen made the game very difficult. This was the game on which Atari based its Lunar Lander arcade game. Story 56. Before I had my Nintendo Wii, my dad let me play Halo on his Xbox 360. I was about 5 or 6 at the time. Story 57. I was probably around 3 or 4 years old when I played Super Mario on the Nintendo 8-bit console or a game on the Sega Mega Drive. Story 58. The first thing I remember was either Raymond or the Smurfs. I was about 3. Story 59. Alex Kidd, more commonly known as Alex the Kid, was built into the first console I owned, the Sega Master System. Those were good times. Story 60. I have never been able to find it, but it was a Nintendo Entertainment System game in which Mario teaches shapes and basic concepts. It was from the early 1990s. Story 61. I first played Super Mario World at daycare when I was 6. It was the reason I wanted a Super Nintendo Entertainment System for Christmas. Story 62. It was probably either Super Mario 64 or The Legend of Zelda: Ocarina of Time. I was 6 or 7 years old. Story 63. Golden Axe and Prince of Persia, the first pixelated versions. 5 years old. Story 64. I was 5 in 2017 when my sister gave me the tablet to play Schoolgirls Simulator. It is basically a game where you are a girl in a school who can have a normal life or kill anybody with the dozens of weapons available there. Story 65. I was given an old Binatone Pong machine when I was about 2 to 3 years old in the early 1980s. It is one of my earliest memories. My family received it from my uncle, and I loved playing it the most. A year or so later, I was given an Atari 2600 and a few games for Christmas. It was quite old by that point. Around Christmas 1984 or 1985, when I was about 5 to 6 years old, I got a Commodore 64. I read books and magazines on how to write beginner's all-purpose symbolic instruction code and began making very simplistic text adventure games over the next few years. By 1990 or 1991, I got an Amiga, and I was given an Atari ST a year or so later. I started tinkering with personal computers via a youth club, learning Windows 3.1 and doing desktop publishing as part of a small magazine we produced. I did my first upgrade to a personal computer around 1992, installing more random access memory and a sound card so we could play games. By the time I left school in the latter half of the 1990s, I was building my own personal computers from scratch. Summary: I have been interested in computers and video games since I was a toddler around 1982. Story 66. I played Snail Maze on the Sega Master System and Action Fighter shortly after. I was 5 years old. Story 67. It was probably either Frogger or Adventure on the Atari 2600 when I was 4 or 5. Story 68. It was probably the Tank arcade game in 1976. I was 9. Pong was already old. Story 69. I was there at the beginning. The cafe near my house had a Space Invaders machine and later Pac-Man. My neighbor got an Atari 2600 and left it with me while he went to the mines to work, so I had it for 2 weeks at a time for about a year and a half. He had everything except the rifle. Story 70. I do not know because I was about 3 years old at the time. Maybe Chicken Invaders for all I know. Story 71. A prototype of Pong on a Control Data Corporation mainframe in 1965 was very exciting to me as a child. It sparked a lifelong fascination with computers and led to my career. Story 72. It was probably Pac-Man on the Atari 2600. My parents had an Atari before I was born, so I started playing as soon as I was old enough to hold a joystick, probably 2 or 3 years old. Story 73. There were several versions of Pong. The console was called Alex. You connected it to the television. I was about 5. It was in the mid-1970s. Story 74. Various games from my parents' Nintendo Entertainment System collection. I honestly cannot remember how old I was. My mind was blown when we got a PlayStation 1 and games suddenly became three-dimensional. Story 75. Mario Kart 64 in 1997. I was 5 years old and we lived in a tiny mountain town, so I didn't know what video games were yet. Saying it melted my brain to learn I could control what was happening on the television is an understatement. Felt like literal magic. Story 76. Either Super Mario Bros. Or Duck Hunt. I'd have been about 5. Story 77. I was 8 or 9 years old in 1979 or 1980. The first arcade I ever went to was just a few games tucked in a dimly lit back room of a deli in our neighborhood called Pete's Place. There was no advertising for the arcade, you just had to know it was there, probably so parents would not freak out about it. I remember Asteroids, Star Castle, and Battlezone among the first games I ever played, followed by the newcomer Pac-Man. Story 78. Playing Jak and Daxter, the precursor legacy on the PlayStation 2 at 5 years old. Story 79. I do not like questions that, if answered, reveal personal information. Eventually, a profile of a person is created. Story 80. At home, it was Pong on the generic Sears console. At the arcade, it was Space Invaders. Story 81. When I was about 4 years old, I could be wrong, but it was probably Mario Brothers or Circus Charlie on console. On the personal computer, it was Prince of Persia. Story 82. My brother introduced me to Team Fortress 2 and The Elder Scrolls 4 Oblivion when I was 5 in 2010. They remain my top 2 favorite games. I have 5,000 hours in Team Fortress 2 and around 40 to 60 playthroughs of Oblivion, totaling approximately 7,000 hours. Story 83. Playing Call of Duty on PlayStation 1, you would insert that compact disc and pray it worked. I also played Pro Evolution Soccer 2003 on PlayStation 2. The background track is still on my mind around the clock. It was haunting. Story 84. I remember playing Prince of Persia, released in 1989. I don't remember my exact age, but it was in the mid-1990s, so I was probably 6 to 11 years old. Story 85. I honestly do not remember the first, but I remember the oldest game, Pitfall on the Atari. I was probably about 5 or 6 years old. Story 86. Pong is the best game ever because it was the first game we saw and played on a television. Someone correct me if I'm wrong. Story 87. Very hard to remember. It may have been Bump and Jump on the Nintendo Entertainment System. I would have been 4 or 5. Story 88. Man, this is probably unique, but it was Parsec on the Texas Instruments 99 in 1982. I was 5 years old. Story 89. I played Super Mario Bros. On my aunt's Nintendo Entertainment System in the early 1990s when I was a young child. I got my first Super Nintendo Entertainment System and Mario Kart for Christmas in 1994. Story 90. I played Moonlander on a teletype machine connected to a Digital Equipment Corporation Program Data Processor 8 computer in about 1967 when I was 7. Story 91. I played Lego Star Wars, the complete saga on the Wii when I was about 3 or 4 years old. Story 92. Probably Tanks on the Atari, then River Raid. I am 49 and that was when it first came out. Story 93. I was 5 or 6 years old, and I played that Sega Genesis game that says Arise from Your Grave. Story 94. I played Pong in 1979. I was 4 years old, and I remember it because my brothers, who were in high school, hated playing with me. I won most of the time. Story 95. I played Pong shortly after it came out, sometime between 1972 when it hit the arcades and 1975 before its home release. I do not recall playing it in 1972 when I was 12, so probably a little later. Let us say I was 14. Story 96. It was long enough ago that I cannot remember for sure. I was born in 1982, and the first video game system my family owned was the original Nintendo Entertainment System. It came with Super Mario Bros., so there is a good chance that was the first video game I ever played. Story 97. Wii Sports on the Wii, obviously. I still occasionally go back to the same Wii console with the same Miis. I don't have many Wii games, but I have enough to have fun. I mostly revisit Wii Sports Resort, and Wii Party. Occasionally I play Super Mario Bros. Or Mario Kart 2. Story 98. It was probably Tekken, Ridge Racer, or Tomb Raider 1. Those memories are not very precise, so it is hard to say which was first. Story 99. First game I ever played may have been Descent on my friend's dad's personal computer. I could barely understand the real world, let alone try to fly in three-dimensional space. Story 100. I think it was Arkanoid on the Commodore 64. I was 7 or 8. Story 101. I was 3 years old, playing Pitfall, Galaga, and Millipede on the Atari. I played Super Mario Bros. By age 4 or 5. Story 102. I got a Game Boy Advance and Mario Kart for my birthday when they first came out. The rest is history. Story 103. Spy vs. Spy. My cousin had a Nintendo Entertainment System. I was 3 or 4 years old. As we were walking out, my cousin handed me the entire console and all the accessories. She was maybe 8 or 9. Story 104. I remember Super Mario Bros. 2. I was almost 3 years old, sick, and had to miss a family event. So my dad stayed home with me and we played games on the Nintendo Entertainment System for the first time. Story 105. Problems caused by emulating Super Mario 64 on my tablet, playing mobile games on the same device, Roblox on my personal computer in 2017, Sonic Forces, and The Legend of Zelda, Breath of the Wild. Story 106. I believe it was the combat cartridge that came with the original Atari console. My favorites were Adventure and Warlords. Story 107. I allegedly played Super Mario Bros. On my family's Nintendo Entertainment System when I was 2. Needless to say, I don't have memories of that time. Story 108. Hard to remember, but I think it was The Bard's Tale. Story 109. I have no idea. I had multiple generations of consoles at the same time, but it was probably a classic mobile game if I were to guess. Story 110. Duke Nukem, Time to Kill. I was around 5. My dad bought it, did not like it, and said I could play two-player mode but not the story. I tried the story after he walked away and continued to play whenever he was not supervising. Laughing out loud. Story 111. Atari. Maybe a Smurf game where you jumped over fences? Story 112. I played Pac-Man on the Atari when I was about 7 years old. That reminds me I need to do my daily challenge in Red Dead Redemption 2. Story 113. I played Mario Kart Double Dash with my dad on the Nintendo GameCube when I was 4 or 5. Simpler times. Story 114. Playing Space Invaders on the Atari 2600 is my earliest gaming memory. Story 115. My grandfather had a Coleco Telstar arcade in 1977. The first game I likely played was Sprint 2 on an old Atari arcade machine at the bowling alley where my mother bowled. Story 116. Sonic the Hedgehog 2 was the first one I remember. I was about 3. Before anyone asks if I have an original Sonic character, I was always more of a Nintendo person, but I never had a problem with the blue blur. Story 117. I had a very early start in programming but a very late start in video games. I think the first true video game I played was Doom. I was fascinated by how they created the three-dimensional graphics. I must have been at least 40 years old. Laughing out loud. Story 118. My first game was Commando, a two-dimensional game, followed by Red Alert and Generals. Those are golden memories. I was about 5 years old when I played my first personal computer game. I was born in 2005, and in 2010 we bought our first personal computer, a Samsung with an Intel Pentium 3. Story 119. I played Asteroids on an Atari. I think I was about 3 years old. My mom made my dad return it, so I remember playing it once and never playing it again. Story 120. Beast for personal computers is 6 years old. Story 121. I think it was similar to Space Invaders on some kind of old computer whose name I do not know. I remember playing games on it, but I only have a vague recollection of what it looked like. My dad got rid of it before I knew what it was. This was in the late 1980s, which would have made me around 6 years old. I definitely remember playing Atari games like Reactor, Combat, Pong, and Star Wars. Story 122. Super Mario Bros. I was 2 or 3 years old. Even though we were taken there to play, as soon as my mother left, my nanny took the game, played all day, and would not let me play. I still remember. Story 123. What was your mother's name before she married? What was your first pet's name? Story 124. Captain Capper Kattegat, called Privateer in the English language release, was released in 1985, so I am old. Story 125. When I was 5 years old, I played a small joystick console that connected to the television with red, white, and yellow connector wires. It had Pac-Man, Dig Dug, Galaga, and other older games. Story 126. Throw the television off the roof of the vacant warehouse. Problem 12. Story 127. The flight simulator on the Microsoft Disk operating system was so advanced. Oh my God. Comparing the latest version with the first version is striking. Story 128. I was a 1980s kid, the second of 4 children. My mom loved arcade games. Miss Pac-Man, Donkey Kong, Space Invaders, Galaga, Centipede, and various pinball machines. We often played while out getting tacos or pizza. My mom also had an old Atari, and we had games like Pitfall and Ghostbusters. Then, when my mom was in nursing school, we would sometimes spend evenings at my aunt's house. Her teenage daughters had just gotten a Nintendo Entertainment System, and we got a taste of that sweet Super Mario Bros. And The Legend of Zelda life. I can still smell the mildew in their basement. Christmas was great that year. A giant bucket of Lego and a Nintendo Entertainment System with Super Mario Bros., Duck Hunt, Track and Field, and The Legend of Zelda. My mom played as much as we did, if not more. I owe my video game history to women. Story 129. Were Pac-Man, Pitfall, or Frogger on the Atari 2600? Story 130. When I was 6 years old, after watching my father play Diablo 2, he let me use his account so I could defeat some easy enemies and have fun. Story 131. I am pretty sure it was something on my father's Commodore VIC-20. I remember him doing a lot of typing from a spiral-bound book and then playing something really primitive. The first game I clearly remember playing was Pole Position on the Atari 2600. Balloon Fight on the Nintendo Entertainment System came soon after. Then Mario sealed the deal, and I was a hardcore Nintendo kid for quite a while until the PlayStation 2 arrived. Story 132. Who framed Roger Rabbit for the Nintendo Entertainment System? I mostly watched my brothers play, but I got my time in the sun when I was about 4 or 5 years old. Story 133. Not sure if it was my first, but the first I remember playing was Tetris and Super Mario Bros. On the original Game Boy in the early to mid-1990s. Story 134. Contra at 8. I learned life's cheat code is just up, up, down, down. Story 135. I got Donkey Kong 64 on my 7th birthday. I still have not beaten it. Story 136. I was 5 and played Ms. Pac-Man on the Sega Genesis. It was not new. I am pretty sure it belonged to my cousin. Story 137. I think it was Sonic the Hedgehog when I was about 5 or 6. Story 138. I played Jazz Jackrabbit on my personal computer. I think I was 6. I probably played other games before that, like Space Invaders clones, but I don't recall their names. Story 139. It must have been either Banania or Prince of Persia on the Windows 3.1 computers we had in primary school, around 1992. Or maybe Mario Brothers on the Nintendo Entertainment System was first. I am not sure which one came before the others. Story 140. The game version of Revenge of the Sith on the PlayStation 2 is my earliest memory. Story 141. Outlaw. I think that is what it was called on the Commodore 64. Story 142. It was either Donkey Kong Country or Super Mario World on the Super Nintendo Entertainment System when I was probably 4 or 5. That solidified my love of gaming forever. Story 143. I played educational games way back on our Windows 95 era computer, but if you count proper video games, I think my first was Crash Bandicoot. The Wrath of Cortex on the PlayStation 2 back in 2004. I'm 29. Story 144. I played KO Flying Squadron 2 on the Sega Saturn when I was about 4 or 5 years old. Story 145. It was either Namco Museum Volume 1, Volume 3, or Crash Bandicoot 1. I had one of those games when we got the PlayStation 1, and I was in elementary school when I played it. Story 146. I remember playing some old Apple II games on my dad's personal computer. The only one I can think of is maybe The Bard's Tale. Chuck Rock on the Super Nintendo Entertainment System was the first game I was given. Story 147. Super Mario Bros. For the Nintendo Entertainment System. I was probably 3 years old. I remember watching my dad play. At the time he was about 28, and he gave me the controller for about 5 seconds. Story 148. Orc Attack on the Commodore 64. Not stating my age because you might profile me. Story 149. The first games I remember playing were Spyro and Crash Team Racing. I was 7 years old. Story 150. I played Oregon Trail on old-school computers at school when I was 9 or 10. My first real game was the original Quake on a personal computer running Windows 95 when I was about 12 or 13. I still remember cheat codes like Knocklip and Impulse 9. I also remembered the Atari my dad had in the 1980s. We played Dungeons and Dragons, walking through small caverns where we would find dragon droppings or, worse, hear the terrifying sound dragons made that told you they were nearby and you had to run. I do not think I will ever forget that sound. Story 151. Pong, age 9. 25 cents did not last long. Badoop, badiep. Took, boo. Story 152. When I was about 4, I could barely remember anything about the game Farm Frenzy 2. I thought it was lost media, but I recently found it and I'm so happy. Story 153. I played Super Mario 64 at age 5. I spent more time running around the castle than actually playing the levels. Story 154. Rayman, the first three-dimensional one. My dad moved and I shot. I was probably 4 years old. Story 155. I played Math Munchers in kindergarten from a 5.25-inch floppy disk with a weird green filter over the monitor. I played old disk operating system games on the home computer. Warcraft 2 is one I remember most. We had a Nintendo Entertainment System, but I mostly watched the babysitter or my brother play The Legend of Zelda because it was too confusing for me. Story 156. Was Space Invaders or Asteroids first, around 1978? For home consoles, Coleco's Telstar Pong appeared shortly afterward. Story 157. It was a creepy Puss in Boots game. I do not know. It was 2000, and my parents had just bought me a personal computer. They probably picked something age-appropriate to test whether it worked. I was 6 years old. Maybe I had played Snake on my grandmother's phone before that. Story 158. There was a tank game on the Atari. My grandfather had an old Atari with a Radio Corporation of America television and a cabinet he made. He used to build Radio Corporation of America equipment for a living. We did not have a console at home for quite some time. I think I was about 6. We did not get our own console until the Super Nintendo Entertainment System. That was a major purchase and a big deal for us kids. Story 159. I'm 40. How the fuck can I remember Atari? Story 160. The first game I remember playing was Mario Party 8 on the Nintendo Wii. I would have been about 2 or 3 years old. Story 161. Super Action Baseball on the ColecoVision, 1983. I was 3 years old and remember it fondly. I played with my dad. I also played Rocky, the Smurfs, Bert, and Donkey Kong around 1984 and 1985. Then the Nintendo Entertainment System arrived. Story 162. I was 6 or 7 years old in the early 1970s, playing Pong on a prototype Magnavox Odyssey while my father was an engineer at Magnavox. Story 163. Oh Mummy on an Amstrad Color Personal Computer 464 when I was 6, back in 1986. Story 164. I am pretty sure it was Super Tennis for the Super Nintendo Entertainment System when I was 6. Story 165. Pong. I was maybe 5 or 6. I was born when Nixon was still president. Story 166. I first played Sonic the Hedgehog when I was 3 or 4, around 1994. I still play it occasionally, although I do not generally enjoy older games. Story 167. I played Sonic the Hedgehog 2 when I was probably 3 years old, back in 1995. Story 168. Super Mario Bros. It was probably 1986 when we got a brand new Nintendo Entertainment System from my rich uncle for Christmas. We hooked it up in my grandma's basement and played the whole Christmas break. I would have been about 5 at the time. Story 169. I was about 5 or 6 years old, and it was a bootleg version of Super Mario Bros. 2 on the original Game Boy. Story 170. I watched my siblings play Grand Theft Auto Vice City when I was 3 years old, and at the end I got a chance to drive. Story 171. If I remembered, I would tell you. It would have had to be something for the Nintendo 64, by my estimate. The first game I played that was mine, though, was the original Age of Empires. My parents hated games. The only reason I got it was that it came with the computer. Luckily, Age of Empires turned out to be excellent. Story 172. Probably the Digimon game for the PlayStation 1 when I was about 4 years old. Story 173. I played Atari football in 1978 in a pizzeria. I would have been at most 9. We had a Pong home game around that time, but I think it was sent back because it did not work well. Story 174. My earliest video game memory is playing Pokemon Emerald on my brother's old Game Boy Advance. I was born the year the game was released worldwide, and I was 5, I think. Story 175. Probably not the first video game I ever played, but the first ones I recall are Crash Bandicoot, Spyro, and Donkey Kong. Story 176. I played Aero Fighters Assault for Nintendo 64 with my older brother. I think I was about 4 or 5, but it furthered my love of aircraft. Story 177. Not sure, but it was either Space Invaders on a DOS, disk operating system, computer, or Alex Kidd on a Sega Master System, around 1995. I was 5 or 6 years old. Story 178. Call of Duty, World at War. I was about 4 years old and played one-on-one against my dad. Story 179. I think it was World Wrestling Federation SmackDown. Know Your Role 2. I was 5 years old and it was my first time going to my cousin's house. It was the coolest thing I had ever seen. It is a core memory. Story 180. Nintendo Entertainment System. I cannot remember which of the 3 it was, but it was either Joust, Mario Brothers, or Duck Hunt. Story 181. Jet Set Willy on the Sinclair ZX Spectrum, 48 kilobytes. I think I was about 13 or 14 years old. Story 182. I played Super Mario on the old Nintendo when I was very young. I don't even know if the controller was plugged in or if my brother was humoring me, but it was amazing. It was a hand-me-down, I think, from my youngest uncle, who is a lot younger than my mom but only 10 years older than my brother. Later, when my brother could afford his own consoles, he always gave me his old ones. The fascination and excitement I felt back then was unforgettable. Story 183. Pong is definitely not the worst. At least you knew what you were getting into, and it was a lot of fun. A great family game. Story 184. I think it was either Super Mario Bros. Or Duck Hunt on my parents' old Nintendo Entertainment System in the mid-1990s, so I was probably 4 or 5. Story 185. Word Munchers, Number Munchers, The Oregon Trail, and the game where you swam around eating things as a fish. I can't recall the last. This is the 1990s. Story 186. In the early 1980s, my uncle owned a bar. He had a glass-top Space Invaders cocktail table. It was always unlocked, so you could play as much as you wanted with a single quarter. I felt like I had won the lottery. Story 187. The Commodore 64 came with bootleg copies of Test Drive, Law of the West, and Zaxxon. I was 4. Story 188. I started with Pokemon Red when I was 7. Felt magical at the time. Story 189. I played dress-up fashion games on my 2000s computer when I was 6 years old. Story 190. My first memory of video games is playing the World Wrestling Federation game at your house on the PlayStation 1. Story 191. My earliest memory is bowling for the Atari, probably around 1993. The Super Nintendo was a game-changer after that. Story 192. Pretty sure it was Asteroids on Atari. Maybe it was Missile Command, but I don't really remember. It was over 40 years ago. Story 193. I was 9, I think. The first games were Karate Champ, Mario and Monster Trucks. Story 194. Pac-Man on a tabletop console in a pizza restaurant. I was 7. Story 195. It took a while to remember since it had been so long, but it was Einhander for the PlayStation. I was probably 5 or 6 years old at the time. Story 196. Pong. Around 1971 to 1972 when I was 15. It was a single-game console about a foot wide, with both paddles built in as large dials, and if you were not careful you would accidentally bump the other player's arm at a crucial moment. We had a big, heavy black and white Zenith in a cabinet that we had to pull all the way out from against the wall so we could attach the adapter selecting channel 3 or 4 on the video home system antenna connector. If I recall correctly, the game had switches to select slow, medium, or fast speed and small, medium, or large paddles. Primitive times. Story 197. It was one of those handheld grayscale liquid crystal display consoles. If I recall correctly, it was Donkey Kong. Came out in 1982, so I was 10. Story 198. I am pretty sure it was pole position on my Commodore 64 when I was 4 or 5. Story 199. The Quest of the Rings on the Magnavox Odyssey system. I was probably 6 at a friend's house. It blew my mind. It included a board game and other components. Everything felt so high quality. Story 200. Red Faction Guerrilla. I was probably about 6 or 7. I remember smashing buildings with the sledgehammer, driving cars off cliffs, and watching them explode. I laughed. Story 201. On cartridge-based video game systems, the equivalent of Pong was Combat, which was included with the Atari 2600. Story 202. It was probably Tecmo Super Bowl, Sonic, or Mario. I was about 4 years old. My dad and uncles all played video games in the early 1990s, so they have always been around. Story 203. I played Super Mario Bros. With my dad and brother on the Nintendo Entertainment System when I was probably 5. Story 204. Hard to say, but I think it was Earthworm Jim on the Sega Genesis around 1994. Story 205. When I played New Super Mario Bros. I was probably around 6 years old and stuck on the first world for weeks. Story 206. I was around 7 when I first played House of the Dead. Decades later, my brother and I went to an arcade and saw the game. We immediately played through the whole thing. Luckily, the machine was already somewhat old, so no one was waiting to play, and we kept going, laughing. Story 207. I think it was the Dam Busters on the Commodore 64. I was 6. That was 40 years ago. Story 208. My first memory is of Super Smash Bros. Melee. Laughing because I beat my brother by spamming side tilts. It was 2003 and I was 3 years old. Now I'm 25 and have been playing ever since. Story 209. I remember playing Grand Theft Auto San Andreas on a trashy computer. I was in first grade back then, I guess. The game is still pretty good, in my opinion. I found it hilarious. Also, Duck Hunt was so good, and Wii Sports is still pretty awesome. Story 210. Playing Afterburner or Operation Wolf in the arcade in the late 1980s. Story 211. I played World of Warcraft with my dad when I was 5 years old. I was born in 2002. Story 212. Perhaps Asteroids. My neighbor had an Atari 2600 when I was a child, and I do not clearly remember which games she had. Story 213. I played Cruisin' United States of America on the Nintendo 64. I was 4 years old. My second game was Super Mario 64. Thanks a bunch for sticking around till the end of the video. Remember to subscribe, and until next time, stay awesome and goodbye.